Great. Hello, class, and welcome to our next in a series of fireside chats for our course on managing public organizations. As a reminder, the purpose of this discussion is to provide you with some practical context on specific topics we are covering in this course. This fireside chat will focus on appropriations and goal setting. I'm pleased to welcome two colleagues who I've worked with at CDC. Both are very knowledgeable about the federal appropriations process and the linkages between that process and goal setting for the agency. I'm pleased to talk with them today on this important topic. First, I'd like to introduce Jeff Morelli. Mr. Morelli is the former Associate Director for Policy at CDC's Division of Foodborne, Waterborne, and Environmental Diseases. He recently retired after 38 years of public service in both the legislative and executive branches of our federal government. Jeff started his career in 1983 working on the professional staff in the U.S. House of Representatives. After working in the House, Jeff transitioned to a position at CDC where he served in CDC's Office of Appropriations, liaisoning between CDC and the Senate and the House Appropriations Committee. Jeff played an integral part of the 25-year effort to modernize CDC's buildings and facilities, an effort started in the mid-90s and reaching its completion sometime in 2023 or 2024. They just broke ground on the last building. After serving in this role, Jeff transitioned to the National Center for Environmental Health, where he served as a division policy lead, continuing his liaison activities with both appropriators and authorizing committees. In 2011, Jeff assumed his last role at CDC as the Associate Director for CDC's Division of Foodborne, Waterborne, and Environmental Diseases, where he successfully worked with congressional staff and strategic partners to expand that program. Welcome to the discussion, Jeff. Happy to have you.
Thank you.
The second speaker today for our fireside chat is Mr. Tom Keene. Tom started his career as a licensed attorney practicing privately, as well as a stint with the U.S. Department of Transportation. After completing his master's degree at the University of Georgia, Mr. Keene joined CDC as a Presidential Management Fellow, serving as a public health analyst working on budget, performance, and evaluation at CDC's National Center for Environmental Health. He joined my team at CDC's Division for Heart Disease and Stroke Prevention in 2016, serving in a similar role, and in 2019 was promoted to the role of team lead for our policy and partnerships team. In this role, he has a number of key tasks, including the budget development and performance evaluation processes. Thank you for joining us here today, Tom. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome.
As I indicated previously, our discussion today will focus on team building and will be driven by a series of questions. So let's start this discussion with Jeff. Jeff, let's start with some basics on the appropriation process. What's the difference between authorizing and appropriating legislation? And what's the difference between discretionary and mandatory or entitlement spending?
These are all great questions, Sal. It takes a little bit of explanation, so let me just sort of dive in. But before I do, just one quick note up front. I'll use CDC programs and other public health programs as specific examples as I go along. So just because I know them the best. So I'll refer to them frequently as we go along. So to dive right in, for any federal program to exist and to function sufficiently, to do its assigned duties, it needs two things. It needs an authorization from Congress to exist, which would include details about the scope of the program's activities and duties. And it needs an appropriation of funding to pay for it, all of its necessary expenses and things you all know about, such as salaries, benefits, paying for the lights, the IT systems, those kinds of things. So again, authorization and appropriations are the two things that are needed for a federal program to function in the way it's intended. Related to the second question that Sal was asking about discretionary versus mandatory spending, discretionary spending programs are exactly as the name implies. Their funding is completely discretionary up to Congress. So every year Congress decides how much, if any, funding to provide for programs. For the most part, the funding CDC receives each year is considered to be discretionary. So that means it can change from year to year. And in fact, it does change every year. The exact amount appropriated to the agency changes, again, at the discretion in Congress, but in consultation with executive branch staff. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Another example of discretionary spending programs besides CDC's programs include spending for national security programs, such as the Department of Defense, the intelligence agencies, foreign aid, and so on. In contrast, mandatory spending programs, also called entitlement programs, are structured so that if a person or another entity meets a specific definition, they are entitled to the benefits of that program. Examples of mandatory or entitlement programs include things like Social Security and Medicare, which generally speaking provide benefits for people who meet specific age requirements. So if you're, for example, 65 or older, you qualify for Medicare, and that becomes an entitled benefit for you. One quick note is when you look at the overall federal spending, I don't know, somewhere around $5 trillion a year nowadays. Most federal spending is actually dedicated to entitlement spending. So again, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, a number of various programs that can also be considered entitlement spending, such as the VA healthcare system, as well as some aspects of agriculture programs. So most of it is entitlement spending, not discretionary spending. And there's always a tension that exists, it seems. Some people want to spend more or less on entitlement programs versus discretionary programs. It depends upon the member of Congress and what their particular orientation is, but there's that tension that exists between the entitlement programs and the discretionary programs that are appropriated each year. Now, to sort of better address the questions, let's start with, sort of a basic layout in Congress and then lead into a discussion about legislative procedure that applies to authorizing legislation as well as appropriating legislation. So of course, in Congress, there's a House and a Senate. There are members of Congress and there are staff who work there. And the staff can work in the personal offices for the senators and for the US representatives, or they can work for committees. And I'll get into this a little bit further as we go along. One example of a committee is the Committee on Energy and Commerce, which is in the House of Representatives. This is an authorizing committee, and it is one of the more powerful committees. It has a really broad range of jurisdictions that, as its name implies, includes programs related to energy production, energy efficiency, those kinds of things. It also covers a wide range of different commercial activities. And again, this is on the authorizing level. And so a lot of the commerce-related activities might be on telecommunications, for example, or things like healthcare and public health. These are also authorized by the Energy and Commerce Committee. So the committee is composed in turn of several subcommittees, which focus on specific topics and issues, such as the Subcommittee on Health, which has authorizing jurisdiction over CDC's programs, as well as other public health and healthcare programs. So this is a very important subcommittee for CDC, and we pay very close attention to it. Meanwhile, over in the Senate, the counterpart there goes by the acronym of HELP, H-E-L-P, for the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, which is the authorizing committee there over health and public health programs, such as CDC's programs. The HELP committee, in turn, also has several subcommittees dealing with various topics, including one that focuses on health and public health. So these authorizing subcommittees are very important for CDC and for other agencies to focus on, because they define what activities CDC programs can engage in, and they decide top-line funding levels for specified numbers of years. So in addition to these authorizing committees and subcommittees, the House and Senate each have an appropriation committee, which in turn, each one has multiple subcommittees with jurisdictions that provide funding for departments and agencies within the scope of each agency's authorization. So again, the program is authorized for certain functions, and then appropriations are provided for those functions, but always within the scope of the authorities of the program. In both congressional chambers, the House and the Senate, the appropriations committees have a subcommittee on labor, HHS, education, and related agencies that supply CDC and all other health programs, labor programs, and education programs with their appropriated funding each year. Then there are a series of other committees that focus on other parts of the federal agencies. So now I'll just kind of quickly turn to address the legislative procedures that are used in Congress for authorizing and appropriating committees. Typically, the legislative process starts with a subcommittee when it takes a number of steps, including holding public hearings to hear from expert witnesses about whatever topic they want to address. Next, writing legislative proposals or language that would create changes in the programs or to fund the programs. They hold what are called markup sessions. Markup sessions are where members of the subcommittee consider legislative proposals as well as amendments to the proposals. They vote on those proposals and amendments, and then when the final version is ready from the subcommittee, it's reported out to the full committee, such as, again, the Health Committee in the Senate or the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House, or one of the full committees on appropriations. Then the full committees follow up by basically doing the same set of steps. They might hold hearings, additional hearings, if they want to emphasize something important. They hold markups of the subcommittee bill. They hold votes on the amendments, and then they vote to report out that final version of their bill to the full Senate or the full House. Once that happens, then the House follows again, pretty much the same procedure. They skip the hearings part, but they'll consider amendments to the bill that came from the committee, and again, vote on each of those amendments. And then when it's finished, the House and the Senate basically have two different bills. The last step in the legislative process is there'll be a conference committee that is formed between the relevant committees in the House and the Senate, and they'll work out the differences between their two different bills to come up with a final version, which then gets passed again by the House and Senate and then sent to the president for his signature. So just very quickly, that's the process. There's a much more that goes on here, and again, we'll touch on it as we go along. But I went through this somewhat detailed description for a specific reason, and it's to point out that the authorization process does not often work well, and important legislation might languish for years. And part of it is because at each one of those steps, that's an opportunity to change the bill or to stop it or to make it go faster. I mean, so there are a number of reasons why the authorizing process, has been languishing. On the other hand, there is always a need for appropriations to run federal agencies. And so appropriation bills are needed to be passed every year. So one option in order to resolve some of the authorizing problem is you can put authorizing language into appropriations bills. Now, it's not supposed to happen, but it in fact happens pretty much every year. And this way, you can be ensured that both the House and the Senate are going to vote on it and approve it, and that the president will sign it, because the president has to have appropriations for the agencies to operate. So this makes the appropriations process exceptionally important. And Sal, back to you.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Just FYI, Tom has a hard stop at about 4:40, so I'm going to bounce around questions and hit his questions now, and then circle back with you after. But I appreciate that overview. That was great. Tom, so each year we hear about the president's budget submission that supposed to happen in February is now sliding to March. So my question about that is how important is this submission to the actual appropriations process, and what role does this budget submission really play in influencing that process? And then how does your work from your position at CDC play into that?
Sure. I think if you ask this question to a whole bunch of different people, you might get a few different answers. But the reality of the situation is that once upon a time, way back in the day, there might have been a time where the president's budget was going to go to Capitol Hill and be passed by Congress intact as sort of this is what's going to happen. But these days, it's very much different than that. The president's budget is essentially a messaging document that lays out to Congress what the president wants to happen, what the president prioritizes, and in an ideal situation, what the president would like to see happen. But as a matter of truth, the Congress is going to do what it wants. The Congress is not these days inclined to roll over the president's budget, and they're going to use their power of the purse, and they're going to use the legislative process to create a spending bill that they can find acceptable. All the while knowing that whatever they come up with eventually is going to have to meet the president's approval. So the president's budget certainly will serve as a marker for negotiations, will serve as an indication of what the president wants. If the president's party controls Congress, then obviously the final product is probably going to look much more similar to what the president wants than if the opposition party controls Congress. But the Congress is going to go through the process and work with their stakeholders, work with the non-governmental organizations who want to have a say, with the other stakeholders in the agency, to craft something they think reflects what they would like to see happen, what they can accept. So it is this messaging document, but the bottom line takeaway here is just because something is in the president's budget does not mean it's going to become law, does not mean it's going to happen, because every year the president's budget contains a whole bunch of big ticket, big initiatives that almost never come to pass because they don't control the legislative process. How does this process work for us in my position at CDC? So each center within CDC has a larger budget narrative that really illustrates a few things. They set forth the problems that CDC is trying to solve, what we are doing or have done about those things, and what we have accomplished and what we hope to accomplish in the coming fiscal year. And so the budget narrative will lay out those various things in kind of a narrative format. Within the division level that I'm in, we're kind of responsible for that portion of the document that deals with heart disease and stroke prevention. And so 2 to 3 times a year, the agency comes to us and says, will you update your narrative with new success stories, new accomplishments, new plans that you want to undertake. And then that goes up to various levels of the department for review, to the Office of Management and Budget for approval, to the agency for approval. And ultimately, once it meets with the approval from all of those kind of different levels of review, that gets packaged into the president's budget and sent to Congress. The reality is that, different points of the year, you're able to make bigger or smaller changes to the document depending on what's going on. You're probably not going to be able to go in and propose a whole bunch of new programs unless you've gotten prior approval from the agency. You might be writing it under a situation where you don't even know what the number that the OMB is going to propose for your program is. We're writing ours right now, and we still don't know what that top line number is going to be. So you're writing it to convey what you do, the importance of your work, what you hope to accomplish, but you don't have as much freedom to kind of go off and do whatever you want unless there's been kind of explicit agency approval ahead of time to kind of propose something new or something big.
So the federal budget that the president proposes is really less of a budget as we would view a budget from a household perspective, with just numbers and categories that we're
right,
and more of a policy document.
Exactly.
And a key aspect of this that kind of flies under the radar to a degree is the performance indicators that are associated with that budget narrative. What goes into the development of those performance indicators, and how important are these indicators to both CDC and Congress?
So I think when you're designing a performance indicator for your programs, and that's something that we at the division level or the center level, the program level, get to kind of craft the measures for our own programs. For the most part, those are not dictated to us by Congress or by the White House or the department, although there are probably some exceptions to that rule. When we craft them, we're kind of looking at 2 things: meaningfulness and achievability. You can certainly have measures that will be meaningful, but that are not achievable by the programmatic levers that you're pulling, or on the flip side, measures that are perfectly achievable, but don't really mean anything to the outside observer in the long run. So you want something that shows that you're having a meaningful impact on the subject that you're trying to affect, and that you are doing something that's able to move the needle on those measures. These measures are not supposed to be, as a general rule, contextual, meaning measures showing the broader state of the world that you're not going to have an effect on. Now, in practice, you still do end up with some measures that are sometimes more contextual than others because they're kind of so important to the programmatic area that you're working in. But as a general rule, you're trying to keep those a little more tight and focused to the specific things that you can control. So ultimately, for our division, we're looking at, the percentage of people with blood pressure who have their blood pressure, high blood pressure under control, the percentage of folks who are provided certain levels of services by our programs, the number of services that we're providing for these programs in a given year, and that that's somebody at the outside can see some measure of program success from the measures that we're doing. But even then, it's like I said, sometimes these measures for them to be truly meaningful, you may have to compromise on that achievability sometimes in order to paint a broader picture of the landscape that you're operating in. As for how important are they to CDC and Congress, I think they're very important to CDC. We have a whole program performance office that is concerned with making sure that we keep those measures up to date, that we're using measures that are truly reflective of what the program's doing, that we're achieving the targets, and if we're not achieving the targets, trying to figure out why we're not achieving the targets. And so we spend a lot of time really trying to think about those measures and whether it's appropriate to keep a measure. If we're changing programmatic direction over the course of several years, we might retire a measure. We just retired a couple of years ago, and if we move into new fields of action, we're going to go in and add a new performance measure. We've done that in the last couple of years. As for how important they are to Congress, I think that kind of depends on where you are and what you're doing. I think it's going to depend to some degree on the degree of attention that Congress is paying to your program, and how concerned are they with program performance. I mean, every once in a while, we'll report up numbers, and that'll take congressional interest. As year in and year out, we probably don't get many questions about whether or not we've achieved performance measures or hit our targets or not. Although there have been exceptions to that. But I think in other parts of the federal government, if you're in an area that's generated a lot of attention from Congress, they're going to be paying pretty close attention to the performance measures. But I think in particularly the appropriators, and they're the ones who really look at this document, is try to figure out, should you be given more money based on the kind of success that you're having as a program? And I think to the extent that they're really paying attention to you, they're probably going to pay attention to those measures. And if they're not as concerned and kind of do the same thing with you year in and year out, they're probably paying a little bit less attention.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that insight into that part of the process. Now let's shift back to Jeff. Jeff, as we go through the educational process in this country, we get various flowcharts of how a bill becomes a law, which applies to both authorizing and the appropriating process. But this doesn't really reflect the nuances in that process and the interplay that occurs between congressional staff, executive branch staff, and strategic partners. Can you give this class a sense of how that dynamic works and the role someone in your former position would play in that process?
Yeah, sure. One of the aspects of creating legislation is that a lot of the conversations, a lot of the information exchanges that take place in order to form a bill, a lot of that process occurs outside of what the public usually sees. Sometimes conversations between congressional staff and agency staff take place infrequently between programs and the staff. And on the other hand, sometimes it takes place on an almost constant flow of discussion. And I'll get into some examples of that. But let's start with congressional staff, just to sort of understand where congressional staff are coming from. Overall, many congressional staff tend to be pretty young and less experienced. Now, one exception to that is that committee staff tend to be somewhat older and more experienced, and they tend to have a deeper knowledge base about specific subject matter. But still, there aren't that many congressional staff compared to agency staff. So in contrast, agency staff have literally thousands of employees, many of whom are experts in the many specific topics addressed by the agency. CDC, for example, has thousands of employees with expertise such as they are medical doctors, or they are PhD epidemiologists, microbiologists, veterinarians, statisticians, experts in genomic sequencing and laboratory methods, those kinds of things, data analysis. So CDC, as one example of an agency, has a lot of expertise that frankly doesn't exist on Capitol Hill. So if you're a congressional staffer and you're given an assignment on a particular area, and let's say you're brand new to the area, what do? So one of the important things to do is to turn to the agencies and to get background briefings from them, as well as information you might need in order to form your particular legislative proposal. So yeah, because no congressional staffer by themselves or even committee by themselves had all the expertise, they need to talk to other people in all through the federal agencies. So that is one set of communications that takes place for legislation. This is for authorizing legislation as well as appropriations. So that on authorizing legislation, they might ask about specific provisions that they're considering and whether that would work. Or on the appropriation side, they might simply ask you how much money a program needs in order to meet a certain performance standard. So that's one set of interactions. Another set of important players are strategic partners working for a wide variety of organizations. For example, in my most recent job, the division I worked for focused on multi-state foodborne disease outbreaks. So when you hear about CDC investigating, for example, a salmonella outbreak or an E. coli outbreak, it's my former division that is in the lead on that particular investigation. To do this job, we need to work really closely with food industries, consumer groups, environmental organizations, law firms, and lobbyists of many different varieties. So in summary, it just takes a large team of many sectors in society to work together on foodborne disease outbreaks, as well as all other types of public health challenges. So this is not unique to just foodborne disease outbreaks, but there are many partners involved with other public health programs. As a result of the discussions we have with these many sectors in society, and when combined with the science produced by CDC, we can serve as an important source of expertise to talk to when Congress is considering bills related to, for example, food safety. The same is true about the importance of talking with other experts at CDC about their particular public health topics. An example of this communication is the tremendous amount of discussions between congressional staff and CDC that are going on as we speak as a result of CDC's coronavirus outbreak response. There are discussions that are taking place daily to update congressional staff on progress made on the pandemic, on responses to requests from Congress about the amount of funding that might be needed for one or another aspect of the response, the science related to new strains of the virus, and so on. And there are many, many other topics that get covered pretty much on a daily basis during the coronavirus response. So that's just one example of the sort of discussions that take place in that's very immediate taking place today. I've also participated in discussions where lobbyists are responding on part of their clients to press CDC to do something or to not do something related to the pandemic in this case. Sometimes these discussions are really helpful and sometimes they're unhelpful distractions, but they're important discussions all the same for a number of reasons. One is that lobbyists have connections to important members of Congress, and you need to be mindful of that. Another is that lobbyists can be important conduits of information to congressional staff. So that's important to keep in mind as well. A third is quite simply that the Constitution permits people to organize and petition their government, which sometimes is done by a lobbyist. So lobbyists can be very key participants in the whole process. The larger point is that there are many discussions and levels of discussions that take place on a frequent basis to produce the best outcome possible from Congress and from the agencies. Granted, it doesn't work perfectly all the time, that's for sure. Sometimes what comes out of Congress is suboptimal, or what comes out of an agency can be suboptimal, but it is part of the process and it involves a great many people. One of the key points here, though, is that creating and maintaining those relationships with a wide variety of stakeholders is important for the whole process to work well and for programs to function well. So.
Appreciate that, Jeff. I think you've described, what in the academic literature is known as the iron triangle, the relationship between, congressional staff, executive branch staff, and private sector lobbyists, and it's alive and well in terms of interplay on a daily basis, I think. Before I get to the last substantive question for Jeff, I know Tom is up against time here, and I want to give him an opportunity to share any final thoughts he might have on how early to mid-career professionals can develop their budgeting and goal-setting skills. and then we'll let you go. So I appreciate your time, Tom.
I mean, I think it kind of goes back to, if you're talking about budgeting and goal setting, I think you want to kind of go back to what I was talking about with performance measures, is that you need to think about what is the most meaningful thing you can do and what's the most achievable thing you can do, and try to marry those two concepts as best that you possibly can. That's going to be something that's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. That's going to give you the most kind of visible, outcome that you can look to. I think. Unfortunately, that's kind of up against the times. So that's really all I've got.
All right. I appreciate that insight, Tom. And I thank you for participating in this discussion. It's been great. And I'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Sal. Appreciate it.
Thanks,
Bye,
Tom.
Jeff.
Jeff, so the last substantive question I have for you, Jeff, and then we'll get your final thoughts on what early to mid-career professionals can do in terms of their skill building activities, is focused on how appropriations drive policy. And one of our former colleagues, Don Schreiber, who used to run our CDC's Washington office, used to utter that mantra constantly. It's appropriation that drives policy, meaning that you really don't want to focus too much energy on authorizing activities, because when all is said and done, you can authorize 100 programs, but if you provide funding to one, that's the only one that really matters. So how have you seen that perspective play out in the real world over the course of your career?
Yeah, and so Don Schreiber, haven't heard that name in a little while. It's great to hear it. Yeah, he's absolutely right about that. The appropriations process really does make a difference. And exactly as you said, you can have an authority for a program, but if you don't have the funding for it, then it just kind of doesn't run. So let me give a couple of examples to illustrate this. One really stark example is CDC's lead poisoning prevention program. This is a program that's been around for a very long time, and it focuses primarily on preventing lead poisoning in children and communities by addressing the problem of lead in paint that little kids sometimes peel off a wall and eat, or sometimes it might be lead in their water system, either resulting from old lead pipes or sometimes from mismanagement of the actual water distribution system. I mean, you can think about Flint, for example, as one example of that. A decade or so ago, the amount of appropriated dollars for this important public health program was reduced from $27 million down to $2 million. This is on an annual level. And this huge reduction took place all at once. Now, the reason it happened, and we were told this by the appropriations staff, is that nobody, absolutely nobody, talked to the appropriations staff about this particular program. So nobody from the agency, nobody from any public health organization or from a child health organization, environmental group, or any other organization came to talk to this particular appropriation staffer or any other appropriation staffer about the need for funding for this program. So when the time came to make the difficult decisions about how much money to put in this program, that program, the third, fourth, 10th program, whatever, well, politically, what they're thinking is, well, this other one here, I'm hearing quite a bit about, but hey, I haven't heard anything about the lead poisoning prevention program. I'll just move the money from it into another program. And that's what happened here. So,
and by the way, I was actually in the room when that statement was made. You could have knocked me over with a feather, because I'd never heard a staffer be that upfront and honest about the process.
Yeah, I think the way he summarized it was you have a partner problem. Yeah. Or in this particular case, a lack of partnership problem.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So that was a really blunt statement. You're exactly right. And it underscores the importance of strategic partners, which leads into and segues nicely into this next example. A very different example, as Sal mentioned, I worked on CDC's buildings and facilities effort. Really quickly, if you had toured CDC's campuses 25 to 30 years ago, you would have been surprised, even shocked, actually, at how horrible the conditions of the laboratories and office space truly was at that time. Facilities were extremely outdated. For example, many of the laboratories at our Chambly campus at the National Center for Environmental Health were actually contained in old World War II era wooden army barracks that were termite infested. They would leak when it rained, and they were literally falling down. They were in horrible condition, yet these were laboratories that CDC was using. On CDC's main campus, it wasn't much better. Scientists often did not have safe spaces to write their reports, and so often wrote them while sitting next to areas where experiments involving really dangerous pathogens were taking place. And it was severely overcrowded. It was not good at all. So visiting science, just to underscore it again, visiting scientists from developing countries often remarked that they had better laboratories and facilities than CDC had at that time 30 years ago. So it was bad. Today, that is no longer the case. If you visit CDC's campuses, you'll see impressive and modern laboratories and office buildings that are among the very best in the world. And as Sal mentioned, ground was just broken on yet another very modern laboratory that will be completed the construction of which will be completed in a few years. The story about this amazing transformation involved a number of strategic partners from well-known business leaders here in Georgia, as well as information we provided when asked by Congress and the appropriations committees all working together. Specifically, what happened was a group of business leaders from Georgia took it upon themselves to work together to get the attention of Congress to focus on this problem and fix it. At that time, we had the authority to build new buildings, although we did receive additional authority that I helped to write. And we had a buildings and facilities master plan waiting to be implemented, but we didn't have the funding. So what happened was the strategic partners paid visits to congressional offices. They actually went up to Capitol Hill. And they met with senators, they met with representatives, and they met with the staff working for them. And nobody from the state of Georgia was going to turn down these particular partners because, again, they came from major business and major employers in the state of Georgia. Shortly thereafter, these meetings, I received calls from the staff saying, gee, these meetings have taken place. They were really amazing. How much money do you need? So we went from a program of approximately $17 million per year, which was basically just enough to do a little bit of maintenance. And we had, so 17 million per year. And then we went to a high of $269 million per year over a brief period of time. So the campuses were transformed into the modern structures that they are today. The way policy was driven in this case by the appropriations committees is that CDC would not be able to function at a high level in any of its programs without funding for modern buildings and facilities. We have to compete for personnel, just like everybody else. Previous to the investment in the structures, CDC would often lose experts, either to the private sector or to academia or somebody who could offer bigger salaries as well as modern laboratories and offices to work in. And as mentioned earlier, CDC needs a large staff of professional experts, highly trained experts in a wide variety of sciences to do its job. So in this case, it's an example of the way that appropriations drove the programs and therefore the policies related to public health.
And without going into specifics, when you talk about strategic partners, you're talking about CEOs of Fortune 500 companies.
Exactly. Yeah, it was a collection of former CEOs, again, from major S&P 500 companies here in Georgia, as well as, at that time anyway, current executives, people who currently were running major businesses in the Atlanta area and throughout Georgia. So it was a really impressive collection of people. It was also interesting to see, quite frankly, how much attention they could wield really quickly. I had gone up to Capitol Hill myself to let the Georgia delegation know about the problems, and they were all sympathetic, but they all said, gee, we just don't have the funding. Well, when a large group of CEOs walked in, it was different. And for understandable reasons. I mean, they really carry a lot of clout. They were amazingly accomplished in their own rights, and people listened to them. So that was good.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's going to serve as a good segue into our strategic partnership conversation, which happens in a couple of weeks. So I appreciate that.
Don't
Um,
forget the business sector. They matter.
Yeah, they really do. So my final question is the same one I posed to Tom earlier. Do you have any final thoughts on how early to mid-career public professionals can develop their budgeting and goal setting skills?
Yeah, one or two thoughts here. To the extent you can, plug into information sources, really high quality information sources, related either to Congress or to state legislature, wherever you might be focused. And then follow those sources really quickly. And the sources could be a variety of different areas. I mean, it might be journals that you subscribe to. It might be, looking at websites frequently. It might be talking to lobbyists. It might be talking to people in the business sector. Whoever you think the partner might be, they can source and serve as really important sources of information for you too. When you are able to pull together all these different information sources, you're then able to put together good policy proposals, and hopefully at some point present them to either your superiors further up the chain, and or the legislative body that you need to persuade. So I think information sources are really important, at least first steps, in order to become familiar with the process, the players, the limitations. That's really important to understand the limitations, the funding limitations, authority, types of limitations and so on, so that you can navigate all those different obstacles and produce good policies and recommendations for goals for your programs.
And I think it's important to note that even though our examples are focused at the federal level, that type of engagement can happen at state and local levels as well. It's a matter of size and scope rather than not being able to do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's an important point.
Well, great. I want to thank you again for your willingness to share experiences with my students at Clayton State. I really appreciate your time and know that these insights will be very useful to the students as they progress through the course.
Good. Glad to do it.
Thanks, Jeff.